afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the speaker of our next TeTra Lecture, Marianna Shreve Simpson. Dr. Simpson is an independent scholar of Islamic art who obtained her PhD from Harvard University in 1978 with a doctoral dissertation on the so-called small Shahnamas. Since then, she has had an extensive career curating, researching, publishing, and teaching on medieval and early modern Islamic art in general, and the arts of the book, especially Persian illustrated manuscripts in particular. Her professional career has included administrative and curatorial positions at the National Gallery of Art, the Freer Gallery of Art and Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, the Smithsonian Institution, and Walters Art Museum, Baltimore, as well as numerous visiting professorships throughout the United States. She served as guest curator at the Princeton University Art Museum, and between 2012 and 2019 as a visiting scholar in the Department of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's currently affiliated with the Schoenberg Institute at that university. For those who did not know her before, but may have Googled her in the meantime, you may have found out that she also developed an intensive introductory course on Islamic codicology, which she taught first in 2006 at the Walters Art Museum, and then started teaching again in 2018 at the Free Library of Philadelphia through the Rare Book School of the University of Virginia. And she's teaching that now together with Kelly Tuttle. Listing all of her publications here will take us too far, but I would like to mention some of her books. There is Arab and Persian Painting in the Fogg Art Museum, published in 1980, Sultan Ibrahim Mirza's Haft al-Rang, a princely manuscript from 16th century Iran, published in 1997, Persian Poetry, Painting and Patronage, Illustrations in a 16th Century Masterpiece, published in 1998, and more recently, Princeton's Great Book of Kings, the Pek Shahnama, published in 2015. Finally, I think I should also mention here the Marianna Shreve Simpson Islamic Manuscripts Collection at the University of Michigan Library. This is a collection of more than 5,000 digitized pages of Dr. Simpson's notes pertaining to more than 600 Islamic manuscripts from around the world. Her legacy and impact on the study of Islamic manuscript and their art is indeed phenomenal and tangible. It is therefore my pleasure to now give her the floor to talk about a very special manuscript in Philadelphia. Please.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for that nice introduction. And let me now share my screen. This is going to be the tricky part for me, but we'll see if I can do it. Okay. There. Great. All right. So Dioscorides Disordered, a fragmentary Kitab-i Hashayish in Philadelphia, and a perennial challenge for specialists in illustrated Islamicate manuscripts, whether they're Arabic, Persian, Turkish, or Indian, is how to deal with codices that have been disbound, dismembered, and dispersed, usually with a text block in one place, typically an institutional collection like a museum or a library, and the detached illustration scattered in many other places. The common art historical impulse, and I imagine this is also the case in the study of European illustrated manuscripts, the common impulse is to track down the far-flung codices, far-flung folios, reunite them virtually, if not physically, with their parent manuscript, and reconstruct their collation, thereby bringing order to disorder and enabling research on issues such as a work's original production, materiality and codicology, textual particularities, pictorial program, text-image relations, and the like. Among the best examples of this Islamic art history practice is a richly illustrated Arabic copy of Dioscorides' De Materia Medica, or to give its Arabic name, the Khawass al-Ashjar, dated 612 of the Hijra, which corresponds to 1224 of the Common Era, belonging to the Suleymaniye Library in Istanbul. Sometime in the early 20th century, a few dozen folios were removed from the parent manuscript and eventually ended up in public and private collections worldwide, including many in the United States. While the history and art history of this 13th century Arabic manuscript were well known to me, especially since several of the folios, like the two on the screen here, belong to institutions where I happen to have studied and worked over the years. The De Materia Medica was the last thing on my mind in 2022 when I was invited to host an online program at the Schoenberg Institute at the University of Pennsylvania, or Penn as it's known. The program is called Coffee with a Codex, very catchy title. Excuse me, and features manuscripts belonging to the university's collections. The invitation came with the specific request that I present an illustrated Dioscorides manuscript, shelf mark LJS 278, entitled the Kitab-i Hashayish, or Book of Herbs, written in Persian and cataloged as having come from late 16th century India. So there was the invitation I received, no problem, I said, without having any idea whatsoever of what I was getting in for. Because although the program, this Coffee with the Codex program, is delightfully informal, and although I had leafed through the manuscript on a couple of occasions and I'd perused the digital metadata and the digital surrogates, I basically knew nothing of significance, like I had nothing worth saying about LJS 278 or its 300 plus illustrations. So I took a longer and closer look at the book itself, delved more deeply into the invaluable database, talked about it for a half an hour on Coffee with a Codex, fielded a few questions, and in the process got totally hooked on trying to figure out more about its textuality and especially its materiality, production, and history. So my presentation today is basically what results from a fixation with something very far removed from my previous art historical interest and efforts. My first task was to get up to speed on the textual history and transmission of the botanical cum pharmaceutical handbook that is De Materia Medica. As many of you doubtless know, it's a long and complicated story, beginning with its compilation by the Greek physician and botanist Pedanius Dioscorides in the middle to second half of the first century of the Common Era. The scholarly literature is vast, and I just want to signal a new and very stimulating book on botanical icons by Andrew Grebeler, with apologies if I'm mispronouncing the author's name. The Materia Medica text consists of 5 books or discourses, which describe hundreds of herbs and plants, as well as other natural substances such as animals and minerals, and discusses their medicinal and therapeutic uses. From the original Greek, Dioscorides' Pharmacopoeia was rendered into Syriac in 9th century Baghdad by the preeminent translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq, and then into Arabic from the Syriac by Istefan ibn Bazil under Hunayn's supervision. As it happens, the Penn manuscript refers directly to this polylingual chain of textual transmission in an inscription on the book's topmost folio at the end of Discourse 2, just beneath the depictions of the greater and lesser orpine plant. And just to remind you that Persian, like Arabic, like Hebrew, reads from right to left, and orpine is a herbaceous succulent also known as sedum. So here is the inscription. Thus ends the second discourse of the book as conveyed by Hunayn ibn Ishaq from the book of Dioscorides from the Greek language to Syriac. Another illustrated and intact copy of the Arabic text. Now to remind you that, to stress that the text in Philadelphia is written in Persian. What we're looking at on the screen is an Arabic text said to date from the 3rd quarter of the 12th or early 13th century. It belongs to the shrine of the Imam Reza in Mashhad, Iran, which received it in 1608 as a pious donation from Shah Abbas I, then ruler of Iran's Safavid dynasty. Notwithstanding its importance, this Arabic manuscript has never been fully published, though it has occasionally been occasionally been exhibited, including in the United States. And the black and white photos that I'm going to be showing you are courtesy of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where the Mashhad Dioscorides was on view in 1949. Before endowing this manuscript to the Mashhad shrine, Shah Abbas is believed to have commissioned a Persian version of the Arabic text from a translator named Riyath-ad-Din Muhammad Rezavi, about whom little seems to be known. Although this royal volume no longer seems to have survived, two illustrated copies of the Persian translation are known. One, on the right of the screen, is dated 645 of the Common Era, is in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Moya Parry, the curator of the Islamic holdings there, for a set of digital images of the manuscript's illustrated folios, including the colophon where the translator's name appears. The other illustrated Kitab-i Hashayish on the left is dated 658, belongs to the Institute of Oriental Studies in St. Petersburg. It was exhibited in Europe and the United States 30 years ago, and a dozen or so of its folios, illustrated folios, were published in the exhibition catalog, and those reproductions of the source of the images that I can show today. Not being a textual scholar, much less an expert on Dioscorides, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but on the basis of a random but not inconsequential selection of line by line, word by word comparisons, I can report with confidence that the pen manuscript contains the same Persian text as the 645 Codex in Dublin and the 658 one in St. Petersburg. This makes it the third extant exemplar of the Kitab-i Hashayish as translated by Riyath-ad-Din Muhammad Rezavi. And just to give you one example of how I arrived at this conclusion of textual kinship, here are shared folios from the first Dioscorides discourse with discussions and representations of the iris and the white garden lily. Although the painting styles differ, something I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, the overall plant iconography is similar, and I trust you'll take my word for it that the Persian text on these folios is identical. And just to explain a bit further, in all three manuscripts, the red lemma are given in Arabic or Arabicized transliterations from the Greek, and the plant descriptions and their medicinal and pharmaceutical properties are in Persian. By now, you will have noticed that the folios in the pen manuscript are not in the same shape as those in the other two volumes. Quite simply, in terms of condition, the manuscript here in Philadelphia is a wreck. That's not the proper curatorial or preservation term, but it's the truth. Already sometime before it entered Penn special collections, the volume had been recognized as an incomplete, that is, fragmentary copy of the Persian Kitab-i Hashayish. In addition, it then lacked and still lacks a cover, although its text block once had been bound, as evidenced by the stitching stations visible on the central fold of many of the leaves. Basically, it consisted and still consists of a stack of 172 loose leaves, including some bifolios, that is, conjugate leaves, and many single folios. An even greater challenge to studying this rare copy of the Kitab-i Hashayish is that its folios are not in correct textual order. At some point prior to the manuscript's acquisition in 1998 by Mr. Lawrence J. Schoenberg, who subsequently donated it to Penn, many of the leaves were paginated in a small library hand and pencil and numbered 1, 2, 355. So in principle, each folio has two numbers, one for its recto and one for its verso. And I say in principle, but actually not in practice, because many pages were skipped in the numbering and then some numbers were repeated. Although these numbers, such as you see here, are helpful for collection inventory purposes and have served as the initial basis for the individual recto and verso listings in Penn's digital database, they do not correspond at all to what would or should have been the folio's original textual order. Furthermore, while each bifolio opening has text continuing across its facing sides, as you'd have in any manuscript, and as you can see here, the text itself is rarely sequential, since two conjugate folios would have been nested with other bifolios as part of the original system of quires or gatherings, that is to say, its collation. In short, the text block of LJS 278 is in total disorder as a copy of the Kitab-i Hashayish, hence the title of my talk and of the forthcoming article about it in the journal Manuscript Studies. It's almost as if the whole thing had been taken apart and flung up in the air. I have a vision of somebody tripping at the top of a steep staircase like here. And then the leaves gathered up and reassembled at random, after which they were numbered in an effort to keep them straight. But even the numbering was done sort of sporadically, possibly with a lot of time off and tea breaks in between, and possibly by more than one hand. But notwithstanding this general disarray, I have been able to reconstruct a significant part of the folio's original textual sequence for discourses 1 through 4. And I'll explain how I did that in a moment. And to ascertain that the manuscript's codicological structure would have been composed of quires with 10 leaves, that is, of quinions, as commonly found in Islamicate manuscripts. As for other aspects of its codicology, let me just give you a brief rundown. And again, I'm going to skip certain details in the interest of time. The manuscript substrate consists of quite coarse and seemingly unpolished handmade paper with discernible laid lines that ranges in tone from dark cream to beige and buff. The paper is firm, but not so thick as to preclude the shadow of illustrations on one side of a folio being visible on the other, as I hope you can see on the right. As is typical of Persian manuscripts of the early modern period, the written surface is delineated by a series of rulings in red and black. Both colors are quite faded, with generous margins at the top, bottom, and outer side of each folio. Again, these proportions are typical for Islamicate manuscripts. The written surface contains a maximum of 15 text lines, but this count is variable, as in many cases, the size and number of illustrations takes precedence over regularity in the number of text lines, and even determines the actual shape of the written surface, as we'll see in a moment. But at least the width of the written surface is consistent at about 17.5 centimeters. The folio average size you see on the screen, it's actually cataloged as an oversized manuscript, and it's quite cumbersome because it's not bound. It's very cumbersome to handle. The Kitab-i Hashayish text is written in a black cursive script known as Nastaliq, a classic Persian calligraphic style. Although Nastaliq can be very fluid and elegant, the letter formation in the pen manuscript are irregular, the placement of the words cramped, and the ink uneven, contributing to paleographic difficulties. The overall effect is of a hastily executed transcription, with legibility less a priority, and perhaps by somebody who was not well trained or a professional scribe. In short, the lines of text reflect hurried handwriting rather than controlled calligraphy. Throughout the manuscript, the lemma, as well as section headings and other rubrics, are in red ink in a round script called naskh, generally regarded as a copyist hand and a bit more legible, as perhaps you can see in this left-hand slide. As for the manuscript's production, and again, I'm summarizing here, the centuries-old tradition of Islamicate manuscript illustration was, first, for the text to be transcribed with spaces left for images, and then the leaves passed on to a painter for illustration and illumination. That at least a portion of LJS 278, specifically Discourse 4, involve this normative practice is demonstrated by leaves, such as this bifolio, containing either blank spaces for images or sketchy outlines of images above and below lines of ruled text. These also tell us that the ruling was done before the illustration. On the other hand, many of the manuscript's folios, notably in discourses 1, 2, and 3, were evidently executed in the reverse process. That is, with plants painted first and the text written around, or in some cases between the images. And I should note here that this picture first sequence is also found in much earlier copy illustrated herbals, as has been discussed by Andrew Griebler in his new book. This picture first sequence is most obvious in the Penn manuscript, where the leaves are oriented either on the diagonal or on the horizontal, so sideways rather than vertically, as you can see on folio 88 with images of parsley that's on the left. More radical scribal modification was required for other folios, for instance, folios 57 and 90, where all the plants were painted in the margins. Similarly, on folio 298, the placement and spreading branches of the plants, consisting of spotted dead nettle and 2 species of corn cockle, left room for only 3 lines of text, with lines 1 and 2 indented out of necessity. And here on folio 18, you can tell that the scribe, perhaps you can tell that the scribe wrote over the roots of the horizontal henna plant instead of working around them. So what does all this tell us about the manuscript's production? To fully answer that, it's necessary to consider the manuscript's painting styles. But before we do that, I want to share how it was that I determined that the top plant on folio 298 is a spotted dead nettle, and those below are 2 species of corn cockle, and that folio 18 depicts henna. Well, that one was actually easy because there's a legend that says this is a picture of henna. That was easy. And there are also legends that identify the hawthorn and dog's bush plants above. But I'm not a botanist nor a paleographer, and I'm definitely not equipped linguistically to follow the Persian text of the Kitab-i Hashayish, not to mention the challenge of actually deciphering the hasty hand of the Penn manuscript. So what I needed from the get-go was a printed edition of the Kitab-i Hashayish, what I believe is common paleographic practice, and one that I myself had followed in the past when studying illustrated manuscripts of medieval Persian poetry, like, for instance, Ferdowsi Shahnameh. Unfortunately, there seems to be no printed edition of Rezavi's Kitab-i Hashayish. Fortunately, I was able to determine, as previously mentioned, that the Persian text of LJS 278 is the same as the volume in Dublin, and I had very clear digital images of that of the illustrated openings in that manuscript. Also, fortuitously, the Dublin manuscript, and let me show you that again. Here's Philadelphia on the left and Dublin on the right. The Dublin manuscript is written in a very clear and neat hand, quite easy to read, especially its red lemma, and its depictions of plants and other substances are also carefully rendered. So I did the art historical thing and set out to match the text, the lemma inscriptions, and images in the seemingly orderly Chester Beatty Codex with the disordered and poorly written leaves of the Penn book. But there was a complication in these matchups because the Dublin manuscript also has never been fully studied nor published, and the available digital images do not include many text pages. So the digital corpus has gaps. The images do not comprise a true facsimile. That's not a complaint. It's just an explanation. So I still needed a complete textual guide in order to understand the scientific iconography and give recognizable names to the plants and animals in the Dublin and Philadelphia manuscripts. For that guide or control, I turned to an intact Arabic codex. Now, this is an Arabic codex as opposed to the Persian one in Philadelphia and Dublin. This Arabic codex in the New York Public Library, copied and illustrated in 1889 or 90 for Nasiruddin Shah, ruler of Iran's Qajar dynasty. The New York manuscript was published in scrupulous detail with its 961 images identified in their Greek, Arabic, and English forms in a 1992 catalog of the library's Islamic manuscripts. Not surprisingly, the publication reproduced only a few of the manuscript's many folios, and happily, the whole thing is now available online. The cherry on the tart here is that this 19th century illustrated Arabic manuscript made for Qajar Shah of Iran is a copy of the 12th or 13th century illustrated Arabic manuscript owned by the Safavid Shah of Iran, who had the text translated into Persian before donating it to the shrine in Mashhad. Thus, the textual and iconographic Arabic and Persian dots connect over the centuries, or so I thought, or so I'd supposed. But of course, there's never a straight line between A and B. In the process of comparing the illustrated folios in the Dublin Persian manuscript with those in the New York Arabic manuscript, I realized that the two were not totally in sync, and that certain sections of the Dublin manuscript were missing and out of textual order. So I dropped the Dublin manuscript and instead took up the Arabic manuscript in New York as my main comparanda for LJS 278. All this is by way of saying that my reconstruction of Penn's Persian manuscript is dependent upon the pictorial and iconographic sequence of the 19th century Arabic manuscript in New York, which in turn, and to reiterate, is a copy of the 12th or 13th century Arabic manuscript in Mashhad, which, to reiterate, was the textual source for the Persian codices in Dublin and St. Petersburg. I'm sure there's a Venn diagram here if I only knew how to do it. But using this complicated triangulation, I have so far been able to reconstruct the order of all but 30 or so folios in LJS 278 and hope to be able to finish the job in due course. Since part of the challenge is deciphering our scribe's hasty handwriting, it may be that a handwritten text recognition program like eScriptorium could be applied here. Maybe one of you could advise on that. In any event, in the process of reconstructing LJS 278, I learned of 4 folios that once had belonged to the Penn manuscript before its acquisition by Lawrence Schoenberg, and was able to identify their place in the manuscript's original sequence. And here are the front and back sides of one bifolio in Washington, acquired by the Smithsonian's Freer Gallery of Art in the same year that Mr. Schoenberg purchased the 172 leaves now at Penn. It depicts, the Freer folio depicts Blythe, High Mallow, Hollyhock, Wild Carrot, and possibly Rocket and Dodder, and comes between LJS illustrated folio with Goat Beard, Star of Bethlehem, and Truffles, all from Dioscorides Discourse 2. Another detached folio is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, recently accessioned as part of the renowned Howard Hodgkin collection and currently on view in a special Met exhibition. Over the years, it has been published as representing bamboo, but my reconstruction of LJS 278 places it in Discourse 1 and identifies the plants as 5 varieties of reed. More significantly, perhaps, the addition to the reconstruction of the detached folios in Washington and New York, along with 2 others in Oxford and Singapore, brings the total number of recorded leaves to 178, exactly the number reported in 1982 when the Fragmentary Kitab-i Hashayish was exhibited in a London gallery. So, well, that was a very long-winded explanation of my reconstruction of LJS 278. Discussion of the manuscript's paintings is much more straightforward. The illustrations are all painted directly on the manuscript paper, that is, without any background or framing lines, and rendered in 2 styles, which I have dubbed robust and delicate. The first was used for images in discourses 1, 2, and 3, and the second, and the second for those in discourse 4. The trees, plants, and animals in the robust style appear to have been first sketched in gray and then outlined in bold contours. Tree trunks, stems, branches, and roots are painted in strong shades of brown, gray, and sometimes dark red, with dabs of darker color to indicate texture. For instance, on the bark of the olive and oak trees that we see here. Leaves are often outlined in red and painted in 2 shades of green, with either a contrasting green, yellow, or white pigment used to delineate leaves or ribs. Fruits and buds are similarly varied depending on the species and on the textual description. Oops. Likewise, the bulbs of certain plants, such as leek, onion, and garlic, are colored in dark gray, red, and white. And the overall, the rendering of the plant matter gives the impression of volume, movement, and growth, as if, for instance, leaves were rustling in the wind and roots were spreading out underground. By contrast, and with a few exceptions, the animals, including fish and birds, which are all in discourse 2, appear inert and tend to be in uniform shades of brown and gray with light striations in the same colors for fur, feathers, and gills. The delicate style plants in discourse 4 lack contours and have thin, spindly stems, branches, blossoms, and roots. Their palette of green, brown, and yellow is generally paler than those of colors in the robust style, and the green leaves often have indistinct or even no veins or ribs. Interestingly, the folios from discourse 4 include those where spaces for images have been left blank, as well as plants that have been only lightly sketched in, like these. Furthermore, there are delicate style images, such as the one on the right, where the leaves have been painted while the stems, blossoms, and roots remain in outline form. All this indicates not only that the manuscript was never completed, but that also that discourse 4 plants were painted in a particular order, namely with the leaves first. Furthermore, and contrasting the images rendered in the delicate style and those in the robust, it seems that they were work of totally different hands. In short, more than one artist was responsible for the manuscript's illustration. The 2 distinct styles also point to the possibility that LJS 278 was produced in separate stages, that is, with a hiatus before discourse 4. And now to turn to the most vexing part of LJS's story, its origin. As I mentioned a moment ago, the manuscript was exhibited in a London gallery in 1982. The exhibit catalog dates the manuscript to the month of Muharram in the year 1004, corresponding to September 1595, and gives its probable place of origin as the Sultanate of Bijapur in the Deccan, a region in southwest India. This attribution was credited to Simon Digby, an English specialist in pre-Mughal Indian painting, who gave his opinion, and here I'm quoting from the catalog, in a verbal communication for reasons of language and pictorial style. While the place of origin of the Deccan during the Sultanate of Bijapur, which from 1490 to 1687 was ruled by the Muslim Adil Shahi dynasty, was doubtless based on Digby's considerable art historical expertise and connoisseurship, the very specific date of September 1595 suggests information derived from the manuscript's colophon. My study to date of LJS 278 and its detached leaves has yet to reveal a colophon or any other equivalent documentation. Be that as it may, Digby's attribution for the manuscript's place of origin was regularly repeated in exhibition catalogs over the years, albeit with reference to 3 of the dispersed leaves rather than to LJS 278 itself, and with the date sometimes qualified as circa 1595. This attribution, which as far as I can tell, Digby himself never published, was also carried over into the Schoenberg collection dossier that accompanied the Persian manuscript gift to pen and incorporated into the initial online metadata. The extensive catalog entry for the important intact Arabic copy of Dioscorides in the New York Public Library. So that's the manuscript that was my control for the reconstruction of LJS 278. That the catalog entry for the Arabic manuscript in New York cites David James, former keeper at Dublin's Chester Beatty Library, as proposing that the date of the fragmentary manuscript, now at Penn, should be read as 1054, that is 1645, implying that there was something like a colophon to read. As you may recall, 1645 is the date of the Kitab-i Hashayish belonging to the Chester Beatty. David James himself never published this adjusted date, but it too has passed into the literature. Sadly, both Digby and James are deceased, so there's no chance for checking the basis of their attributions. But one thing is clear: no evidence, either documentary or otherwise, has emerged to substantiate Digby's original attribution of 1595 or James's subsequent rereading of 1645 for Penn's Kitab-i Hashayish. As for the Bijapur and the Deccan as the place of origin, my colleagues who work on early modern Indian and specifically Deccani and Adil Shahi illustrated manuscripts agree that there's nothing within this extensive painting corpus that seems stylistically comparable to the images in LJS 278. So the where and when of the production of our Kitab-i Hashayish remains problematic. One iconographic particularity, however, may shed some light on how it was produced. This image in Discourse 1 of LJS 278, the manuscript's only figural illustration, represents two men, one kneeling, one standing, using iron nails resembling pointed sticks to tap a balsam tree and holding bowls to collect the sap. The same scene to the same text appears in the Chester Beatty manuscript of 1645, but there is a striking stylistic difference between the two. The men in the Dublin manuscript on your left are svelte and clean-shaven and wear the kind of loose, almost floppy turbans and long robes buttoned down the front and tied with sashes at the waist, typical of male figures in late 16th and early 17th century Safavid painting. The Philadelphia figures on your right, admittedly rather abraded, are less than svelte, although not exactly stocky, and wear short robes. The man kneeling to the far side of the tree also has a shawl draped over his legs and across his right arm. Both figures have long curly hair and beards and gold discs like halos that set off their heads from the background. And this, by the way, is a common feature of figural representation in medieval Arabic manuscripts, as in the 1224 Dioscorides scene that we saw at the very beginning of this talk. Nearby in the Penn manuscript, there is a double-headed vessel, presumably at the ready to store the sap. The treatment of this little vignette around the balsam tree in LJS 278, including the men's appearance, clothing, halos, gold bowls, and the double-headed ewer, is identical to that found in the 12th or 13th century Arabic copy of the Dioscorides manuscript, which, as already mentioned, has been in Mashhad, Iran since 1608, and which has been identified as the textual source for the Persian translation of the Kitab-i Hashayish. Whereas the Chester Beatty illustration adopts its tree harvesters to conform to Safavid pictorial style and fashion and omits the storage vessel, the LJS image is faithful to the medieval prototype in every respect. This suggests, although certainly does not prove, that LJS 278 may be a copy, either direct or more likely at a remove, after the Mashhad manuscript, and that it may have originated in 17th century Iran rather than late 16th century India, as formally attributed. Also telling in this regard is that the very same balsam tree vignette, minus the men's halos, appears in another Arabic Dioscorides manuscript dated 1629, commissioned by the then governor of Mashhad named Abul Fath Manuchir Khan. Mashhad was then an important center for manuscript production, and the Arabic text of the Dioscorides manuscript in Mashhad was the model for the governor's copy, also in Arabic, of 1629, excuse me. So this could be another instance of manuscript triangulation. There are other suggestive comparisons in terms of format, iconography, and style of representation in discourses 1, 2, and 3 between the medieval Arabic manuscript in Mashhad, and finally on the left, I can show you a decent color reproduction from that manuscript, and the early modern manuscript in Philadelphia, although the figural balsam tree scene is the most striking. Interestingly, however, the illustrations of the rough bindweed plant in the Mashhad and Penn manuscripts, and in the 19th century Arabic copy of the Mashhad manuscript in New York are quite dissimilar. And given that this plant appears in Discourse 4, the disparity may be yet another indication of a shift or break, or perhaps even a change of model in the production of LJS 278. And now a brief coda pertaining to provenance. In discussing the manuscript's origins a moment ago, I mentioned that it was Simon Digby's expertise via verbal communication cited in the catalog of the 1982 exhibition in London that attributed the Penn manuscript to the Deccan, September, and dated it September 1595. Although that catalog does not identify the manuscript's owner, last year, the catalog's author reported to me, so this is personal communication, you'll just have to take my word for it, that in 1982, the manuscript was owned by Simon Digby. After his death in 2010, the estate executors discovered a bifolio from the Kitab-i Hashayish among his effects and donated it in his memory to Oxford University's Ashmolean Museum, where Digby had served for some time as curator. And this is what you're seeing here, two sides of the same bifolio. In a recent message to the Schoenberg Institute at Penn, the London concern from which Lawrence Schoenberg purchased his 172 Dioscorides folios in 1998 revealed that it had bought the manuscript from Simon Digby in 1997. So far, I haven't been able to verify when and where Digby himself acquired the manuscript, very likely in India. But this is definitely a case where art history, the art market, and manuscript collecting converge. And one can imagine how advantageous it would have been to attribute the manuscript's date, that is 1595, to the reign of the Shah of Iran, who commissioned the Materia Medica's Persian translation and who donated the Arabic source manuscript for that translation to the Holy Shrine in Mashhad in 1608. So all manuscripts have their lives and afterlives. Those of LJS 278 are particularly complicated, even fraught. Further research, maybe by some of you listening today, should be able to put all the existing leaves back into their proper textual order and to shed light on where this fascinating fragmentary work fits into the venerable illustrated history of De Materia Medica and its latter-day Persian manifestation as the Kitab-i Hashayish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shreve Simpson, for this fantastic lecture and for taking us on an exploration of the life of this manuscript, from disorder moving gradually into order, and also for the amazing images that you showed to us. The floor is now open for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand. You're also welcome to write any questions in the chat, and we'd be glad to read them out for you. And perhaps I could start with a few small questions out of ignorance, if you wouldn't mind that.
I'd be happy for your questions, and I know they're not ignorant. So
you described the handwriting of the Penn manuscript as hurried, and I was curious how that goes together with all of the images, which seem to suggest quite a lot of work, effort, artistry, perhaps expense going into that as well. And I was curious if that suggests anything about the background of the manuscript. Was it somehow unfinished? Was it written for practice rather than for display? Or does it suggest that it was intended for a particular audience?
Well, that's a very good question. I actually think that so to remind you also that it's a very large size, it's quite large manuscript. So it wouldn't have been although it would have been the size for display, the content and the quality of it suggest otherwise. I think it was probably made as a reference book for use in perhaps a teaching hospital, a medical school. We know in the 16th century there were such institutions, and much earlier, of course. And I can only imagine that this would have been a perfect way to teach students to distinguish between different plants and different and their pharmaceutical properties. But this was unlike, for instance, the Chester Beatty manuscript, which is very carefully written. This one, as I said, and as you've mentioned, very hastily written. So I don't think it was done for a high level or an elite patron. I think it was really done as a reference copy for an institution, for institutional use. So maybe even commissioned by a hospital, but not necessarily with the kind of resources that would have allowed for a very professional scribe to transcribe the text.
Very interesting, thank you. And the next question is by Madalena Dolka.
I'm not hearing anything.
She seems to be
Perhaps, yeah, perhaps we can transfer Madalena's question to a slightly later moment. I believe there is also a question by Dan Batovic.
Thank you very much. Extremely interesting, everything you presented today. I've noticed in a couple of slides that you showed us that there is a bit of Syriac text, a couple of notes in Syriac here and there. Is that Syriac? I couldn't make it out. Or is it Arabic written in Syriac? And whether that says anything about where the manuscript it's been before.
Well, there aren't, the Penn manuscript does not have, I haven't found any Syriac in the Penn manuscript, but there is, I believe, and I don't know Syriac, so I count on those of you who do to confirm this, confirm or correct. There are inscriptions in Syriac in the 12th or 13th century Arabic manuscript in Mashhad, and many in the 19th century Arabic manuscript that's in New York. And I that's probably where you noticed the Syriac inscriptions, because the New York Arabic manuscript is a direct copy of the 12th, 13th century one in Mashhad, so the Syriac inscriptions would have been copied from one manuscript to the other as part of the transcription. But the Penn manuscript doesn't have those. So that's another question of whether or not was an intermediary, yet another intermediary.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
If you wouldn't mind my jumping in here as well, you described briefly the very wide margins of the manuscripts. And I was curious if this is also in any way intended to invite future marginal notes or annotations or additional images, perhaps?
Well, certainly marginal annotations and commentary, exactly. Although, and there is some marginalia in the Penn manuscript. It's mostly bits of text that I think were omitted by the scribe, and then he went back and wrote them in the margins. But it's very common in Islamic manuscripts for the margin, these wide margins, to be used for commentary, often by multiple hands. So that was probably one of the purposes. But it didn't seem to, it may have been one of the purposes of the margins, but it didn't necessarily result in marginalia.
Yes, exactly. So an invitation that in this case was perhaps not taken up.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Nice way of thinking it.
I believe Madalena Dolka has returned, so I'd like to give the floor to her for her question. if that's convenient.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, sorry, my connection was a bit. Thank you very much for your lecture. Very interesting. So I have a question about the translation, I think. So what is how shall we see the relationship between the Persian and the Arabic, and how does it relate in a sense to the Greek and the Syriac, or was the person was the person translating into Persian? So I understand this is a 16th century translation, if the manuscript is from the 17th or something like this. Did they use anything from the Syriac or from the Greek, or was it only based on Arabic, or how shall we see this? So this is one question. And if I can briefly ask a second one about the iconographic program. So again, does it relate in any way to for instance, to the Greek Vienna Dioscorides manuscript? And also, were there, because you also mentioned that it is possible that this was also done in a sort of school context or in a teaching, as it's a very large one, and with a lot of revised herbal knowledge. And so were there was there any knowledge which was lost, in the sense that were there plants which were not known anymore, and then they didn't know either the name of it? Because I suppose that's quite a complicated thing. These very specific terms, was there knowledge lost in these translations?
So that was 3 questions, I think. So let me
Sorry.
see. The first, no, it's fine. The first one had to do with the translation from Arabic to Persian. So interestingly enough, and I'll just repeat again that I'm not a specialist and never will be a specialist in de materia medica in any way, shape, or form. But as far as I know, there's not yet been a serious study of the textual differeces between the Arabic and the Persian. That which is to say, there's never been, let me put it another way. We have yet to have a serious study of the Persian translation that presumably was ordered by Shah Abbas and would have been in the late 16th or early 17th centuries, based on the medieval Arabic manuscript. So those are the 2 key things to understanding the content between the Arabic and the Persian. You have to study do a very careful study of them, really word by word, line by line, and that hasn't happened yet. The question about the relationship to the early Byzantine manuscript. So actually, this wonderful new book by Andrew Griebler, Griebeler. Does anyone know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly? Griebler. Actually discusses, to a certain extent, Arabic manuscripts in terms of earlier Byzantine manuscripts. And Marie Cognier at the Institut des Hautes Études also has done a great deal of work on this. And as for illustrations, it's the transmission of the text will also help us understand the transmission of the illustrative program and the iconography. And the big picture of that is still remains to be studied. And as for whether or not an institution, as I proposed, maybe a hospital or a medical school, would have recognized plants or not recognized plants, that's also something that specialists in medical history, I hope, can chime in on at some point. So my answers to all your questions are qualified. Basically, I'm not sure. That's what happened. That's how we get. That's how my final position on it. So.
Thank you very much.
There is a question by Andy.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk about a fascinating manuscript. I think Madalena sort of asked the question that I also had, which was in the sense that if this is a reference manuscript, how can it be useful if all of these images in the different manuscripts are so different? Because then you won't really be able to recognize and plant. So that would be sort of, I guess that's sort of my thinking line. And aside from that, just a few notes about things that someone asked, I can't remember who mentioned it before. It's very interesting to see that you have these Syriac notes in the 12th, 13th century manuscript in Mashhad, and then also in the 19th century copy, which was for a very specific Persian context, for which this would not have been useful at all. So someone copied the Syriac words in there, which I doubt would have been recognizable by anyone. So that's very curious. There was a third point, which I can't remember what I wanted to ask. What was it again? I forget. Well, regarding these Syriac notes, maybe also because it's really interesting to see that they just kept them in the Arabic. So they made an Arabic translation, yet they retained some of the Syriac notes. Yes, my last point was just an observation where you have in the Persian translation, so they kept the Arabic words for some of the plants, which sort of has a similar kind of, I guess, a parallel for the West, where now we use Latin names for some of the plants, but we retain the Latin names, and that was an observation that I just wanted to put in as well. So I think maybe not so much questions that I had left, just some thoughts that I wanted to put out there. So thank you very much.
Well, let me just mention that the Arabic manuscript in New York that was done in the late 19th century was done for the ruler of Iran, the Qajar Shah. He commissioned it as basically a fancy coffee table book, a direct copy of the medieval Arabic manuscript in the shrine in Mashhad. So that was like I don't know, this not to be flip, but like a vanity publication. He wasn't going to use it for anything. It wasn't going to be used at the Qajar court for medicinal or pharmaceutical purposes. It was basically a deluxe copy, and the Syriac was part of the original, so the Syriac got copied as part of that deluxe, if you will. It's not edition, isn't the right word, but a deluxe rendition. And now I've lost the train of your first comment. Was anyway.
Yeah, what was it again? Well, I guess the last one was the Arabic, sort of retaining of the Arabic notes in the Persian, the retaining of the Arabic names for the plants in the Persian translation.
It's actually interesting. They're Arabicized translations from the Greek, apparently. But again, this is something that language specialists have mentioned, and I'm just sharing that. I had myself not able to verify that linguistically. That was the actual challenge of working on this manuscript, was dealing with all the different versions, and my initial goal was really just to make physical order, was to make codicological order out of the manuscript. Then you get it, you get involved in trying to understand it, of course. So I've taken it as I consider what I've done to be the first stage which I hope somebody else will now pick up and continue to do a much more thorough study of understanding the relationship between the early modern Persian versions and the Arabic, which in turn goes back to the Greek and the Syriac. So it's a whole process, long process.
Yeah, it sounds like a wonderful project for someone.
Yes, someone, some of you, one of you maybe.
just an afterthought that I had. There isn't a Latin translation of this text, is there? Because that sometimes happens in the Middle Ages when they have an Arabic translation, gets back into Latin. I don't. It's just. It's not hugely important. Just a thing that
I'm
came to
not sure.
mind.
It may be. Again, that's something that this new book by Gribler will lay out for us, and I don't remember. It's definitely it's a brand new book, University of Chicago Press. It's fabulous. So I highly
Definitely.
recommend it for anybody with interest in botanical text and herbals.
I'll definitely have a look. Thank you. I'm looking forward to your publication as well.
I'll let you know.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
I believe there also is a question by Georgia.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I actually have two questions. And the first one relates to the mise en page, because if I got it correctly, when you show the picture of the Penn manuscript and the Dublin manuscript, the plants were pictured and positioned in the same place in the page.
Yes.
Is that a consistent feature throughout all the manuscripts or not? And I ask also the second question, or wait for it?
Well, let me answer that first, because I don't. So consistent across all manuscripts, who knows? There are dozens, but of the Persian ones, the 3 Persian ones that I've now studied or tried to study, the plants are positioned in the same place because basically the text is the same and the layout is the same. So they are somehow copies of something. They're, I mean, at the most you can say at the moment, they are like triplets, not so much stylistically or in terms of the style of the illustration or in terms of the quality of the writing, but in terms of their iconographic and textual contents. So that position is indeed the same on all 3.
And also the dimension is the same of the page of the folio, or does it
pretty almost the same.
Okay.
It's the dimension of the written surface is a little different. Let's see, I don't have those figures in my head at the moment, but the dimensions of the Chester Beatty and the Penn manuscripts, the written surface is similar. The one in St. Petersburg is a little larger. The one in St. Petersburg is also, in terms of artistry and art history, is by far the most elegant and the fanciest and most elaborate of the. I mean, the plants in the St. Petersburg manuscript include things like butterflies and birds as kind of accessories to the plants. It's much more fanciful. And so that was, although we don't know for whom that was made, we can only imagine it was for an elite patron. That may also be true of Dublin, but not the Penn manuscript, I don't think, had elite patronage.
Thank you. And the second question was more of a theoretical approach to the reconstruction. Once the whole reconstruction is done, hopefully soon everything is done, what would you theoretically do, even just digitally, reorder the pictures, even just digitally? I don't mean like do the bounding of the manuscript, or preserve it as it is and it's a history of the manuscript itself.
My colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania at the Schoenberg Institute have kicked around the idea of once every folio can be identified, which still is an issue, but of reordering the digital images.
Okay.
I don't think it would be possible to reorder the physical folios because of the way the conjugate leaves are attached to each other or separate. It would be a conservation nightmare, but digitally it could be done. And that would at least give us an idea of a better way of comparing that manuscript to the Dublin one, which the Dublin one, 1645, my colleagues at Dublin tell me they are planning to do a full digital reproduction. Right now, all I have are the reproductions, digital images of the illustrated folios, which is not the full text. The St. Petersburg, I looked into the possibility of getting a copy of that, but situation being what it is right now, that's not going to be possible. So that's maybe another generation that'll, if relations, academic relations, or can return to some normal sphere, then maybe we can do that. But so digitally, though, at all, things can be reorganized, and that would be great.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you.
There is another question by Madalina.
Sorry, I have one very brief question, if possible. So, in the Byzantine tradition, we do have those portraits with Dioscorides
Yes.
and the 7 physicians. Do we have the same in the Persian one, or are they changed with some local physicians? Or yeah.
Not the 3 Persian ones don't have those author portraits, but there is a very important early Arabic manuscript, not the one that I showed, but another one that does have author portraits at the beginning. It has representation of Dioscorides and a pupil, and the pupil's holding a mandrake root. It's very interesting. So, and that's been well published. It's a manuscript that's in the Topkapi Saray in Istanbul. So the Byzantine tradition of author portraits did continue in the medieval Arabic copies, or at least one medieval Arabic copy, but not seemingly in the later Persian versions. So why that is, I couldn't know.
Thank you. Are there any final questions, perhaps, for our speaker? Dan, please.
Thank you very much. It's all fascinating. You showed that at some point a page with images from all 3 manuscripts, from Dublin and from St. Petersburg and Philadelphia. And
Yes.
you got the slide on which you said, "Trust me, this is the same translation. This is the same text."
Yes.
Same
I did say trust me. Yes.
Yeah. The images are. It seemed to me that the different images were different from one to another. Like the 2 plants at the bottom of each page, they are not exactly the same. So they're obviously not a copy from one another. But what happens there made me think, are there situations where, in the manuscript that you looked at, I mean, where a plant is mentioned and then a very wrong picture is drawn underneath?
You're asking if there are examples of that?
Yes.
Are there instances of that? Not that I found in the Dublin manuscript. The pen one was unfinished, and part of the complication in finishing the reconstruction is that it's hard to actually identify the plants that are unfinished. But to go back to and then the St. Petersburg one, only about a dozen of the illustrated folios are available for study by me, at least. So I don't know if any of those have images that don't jibe with the text. But the iconography of the 3 plants, of the 3 folios that I showed, I know that the quality of the 3 types of paintings were differ, but actually in terms of the way the plants themselves are rendered, they are the same. And I don't know, I can't go back to that, but I can send you the slide to show you. They are the same, and that was what first kind of caught my eye. And then when I realized these 3 folios have these 3 plants, let me look word by word at the text on these, and that's what I started doing, a textual comparison.
Very interesting. Thank you.
I think that when you have a longer time than an image just flashing on a screen, you can see that they are quite similar.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Excellent. If there are no further questions, I propose that we thank our speaker for this marvelous talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.